Let me start by setting a scene that I think will sound very familiar. The year is 1969. After years of research, development, and testing, a 4-day mission successfully lands on the moon. The world watches, huddled around their television sets, as the first human to reach the surface climbs out of the lander. He jumps off the last rung, lands on the lunar surface, and delivers a message meant to echo throughout all history. I take this step for my country, for my people, and for the Marxist-Leninist way of life. Now, for those of you who've seen the Apple TV show For All Mankind, you know exactly what I'm describing. But for those who haven't, that's okay. The point isn't the show. It's about just how plausible that moment feels. Because in the 1960s, the idea that the Soviets could beat us to the moon was a real possibility. And that alternate history helps us understand what was at stake then and what's at stake again today. History, of course, played out differently. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon and delivered one of the most unifying messages ever broadcast, a giant leap for all mankind. The American flag followed, and the story we tell ourselves is that America won the space race. But if winning meant being first, Soviet Union should have won. They stacked up spectacular firsts. They put the first humans in space. They sent the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit, which terrified the West because it meant that something else could reach across continents, like intercontinental ballistic missiles. That single satellite forced the world to confront questions of sovereignty and security in a domain no one had ever governed before. So how did we go from that moment of panic to landing a man on the moon less than 12 years later? President Kennedy famously challenged the nation to go to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard. But what followed wasn't just a sprint, it was institution building. The United States didn't just build a lander, it built up NASA. Standards, supply chains, partnerships between government, industry, academia, and the military. Apollo was the spectacle, but the real victory came afterward. And the Soviet program, by contrast, was centralized and brittle, and when the spectacle ended, their system couldn't sustain itself, and America had won the race. This is the space race we all know about, but today's race, let's call it Space Race 2.0, is the one we should be paying attention to. Once again, we're hearing familiar language in the space community. Race, competition, the moon. But this time, the finish line is misleading. Space Race 2.0 isn't a sprint to a landing site. It's a competition to build permanence. Now I work for a commercial company called Interloon, where we're working to commercialize resources from the moon. I often get asked, why go back to the moon? Didn't we already prove we could do that with Apollo? The answer depends on what you think the moon is. If it's a destination, yeah, we've been there. If it's infrastructure, we haven't even started. So what's actually there? For starters, water. In permanently shadowed craters near the lunar South Pole, there are deposits of water ice. Now in space, water is everything. You drink it, use it for life support. When you split it into hydrogen and oxygen, it becomes rocket fuel. That means that the moon can become a sort of refueling station, a place where missions going deeper and deeper into the solar system don't have to launch every ounce of fuel from Earth. Water makes permanence possible. Now, there's also aluminum, titanium, silicon. Aluminum and titanium are lightweight and strong, ideal for building habitats and infrastructure, and silicon is the backbone of solar panels. Now, if you can manufacture in space using local material, change the economics of everything beyond Earth's orbit. And then there's helium-3. Helium-3 is rare on Earth. We mostly get it in tiny quantities as a byproduct of nuclear processes, and it's heavily rationed at the national level. But on the moon, it's been deposited for billions of years by the solar winds and trapped in the lunar soil. Today, helium-3 has several high-value use cases. We use it in neutron detection for nuclear security, cryogenics for quantum computing. In medicine, helium-3 allows for extremely detailed imaging of the lung function to detect disease earlier. And in the long term, helium-3 could become a potential fuel source for fusion energy systems producing enormous energy to power entire cities around the world. We've seen this play out before, with oil, energy, natural resources. When a resource becomes foundational to economic and military security, it stops being commercial and it becomes strategic. These lunar resources follow the exact same logic. Right now they feel distant, plentiful, optional, But if even one of these resources became economically or strategically decisive, the question won't be whether there's enough, but who controls access? Who sets the extraction norms? Who defines what responsible behavior looks like? Next week, I'm leaving industry and joining the team at NASA to help this administration think through the problems of the next space race. Because going back to the moon isn't about repeating Apollo. It's about deciding who gets to write the operating manual for the next phase of human expansion. Because when it gets down to it, those rules won't be written by committees. They'll be written by whomever's already there. History is clear. When resources matter, competition follows. And competition implies something else, an opponent who understands the stakes just as clearly as we do. So the question becomes not just why we're racing, but who we're racing. China. Now, to be clear, Russia is still a major player in the space domain, but China is the opponent that we ought to be keeping pace with. And if you want to understand the Chinese ambitions in space, don't just start with what they're saying, start with what they're doing. Over the past decade, China has assembled one of the most capable and methodical space programs in the world. They've landed on the far side of the moon, something the US hasn't even attempted. They've returned lunar samples and tested them in laboratories for resource potential, including helium-3. They're targeting the lunar South Pole, the very same region where water ice makes long-term habitation possible. They've stood up their own space station, Tianyang, independent of Western infrastructure. They've stood up their own version of a space force. They're working with Russia on building an international lunar research station. And they've built a full-spectrum satellite architecture, tightly integrated into their economic and military planning. None of this is by accident. China's space program is built different from ours. It's driven by a command economy and a powerful network of state-owned enterprises. That structure allows for long-term horizons, where programs are sustained across political cycles. Space isn't just a prestige project. It's a pillar of state power. Each mission builds directly on the last. Each capability unlocks the next. Setbacks are absorbed, timelines adjust, but the direction does not. That is what playing the long game looks like. Space is also not an exception. It mirrors how China approaches technological dominance here on Earth as well. Just look at their efforts with the Belt and Road Initiative to control strategic resources around the world, or with the thousands of acres of islands that they're building up in the South China Sea. They're playing the long game. Build patiently, control choke points, and shape standards. Even the symbolism reflects permanence. In Chris Davenport's book, Rocket Dreams, he talks about how the American flags left on the moon during Apollo have been since bleached white after decades of solar radiation. So when China planned its lunar missions, it invested heavily in a specialized flag made of advanced composite material, like basalt fiber, to withstand the harsh lunar environment. Now that detail might seem small, but it reveals something important. They aren't just planting a flag, they're planning for it to last. Symbolism aside, capability tells the clearer story. In 2022, a commercial space tracking firm, ExoAnalytic, observed a Chinese satellite SJ-21 rendezvous with a commercial satellite in orbit. It didn't collide with it or destroy it, but it grappled it and towed it to a higher graveyard orbit. Now, on its face, that's responsible debris mitigation, but in space, capability matters more than stated intent. That same technology that can safely relocate your own satellite can quietly disable or destroy someone else's. This was a demonstration of proximity operations and control, the foundation of space superiority. China doesn't need some dramatic first to shape the future of space. What it needs is sustained alignment between state power and long-term strategy. And if that alignment continues, both in orbit and on the lunar surface, then the infrastructure and norms that govern space will increasingly reflect their model. That's what's at stake. And so the natural question becomes, is the US prepared for that kind of long game? Because our system doesn't operate the same way China's does. Our system is noisier, more competitive, more decentralized, but that doesn't mean we're behind. In fact, in some ways, we've already begun building the foundations for permanence, even if we haven't finished it just yet. For 25 years, most of my lifetime, there's always been an American aboard the International Space Station. And that's remarkable, but it's also fragile. It depends on constant resupply, funding, and political will. It's permanence in low Earth orbit. Now, this is personal to me because the man in the center of this photo is actually my father. He spent 6 months aboard the ISS. Watching someone you love live and work in space changes how you think about it. It becomes human. The ISS proved that long-duration life off Earth is possible, but incredibly hard. What it didn't yet prove is that we can sustain that presence beyond Earth's orbit. We haven't cracked that code just yet. We've been building towards it. The ISS also enabled the next breakthrough that changed the economics of space. The NASA commercial cargo program opened the doors to SpaceX. When SpaceX first proved that rockets could land and then fly again reliably, it dramatically lowered the cost of access to space. And when access became cheaper, more frequent, activity exploded. The domain became more and more contested and congested, and so the United States stood up its Space Force to protect the systems we all depend on. The International Space Station is also not just a laboratory, it's an alliance. Now, even Russia, ever the equal opportunist, has been a long-term partner on the International Space Station. In fact, the motto for my father's mission was Одна команда, which means one team in Russian. 15 nations working together in orbit for decades, sharing risk, cost, and access. That model now continues with the Artemis Accords. Today, more than 60 nations have signed on to a framework agreeing to standards of transparency, interoperability, and deconfliction. Now, it's not a treaty or a binding law, but it's an attempt to shape norms before conflict forces them. And one major space power is notably absent: China. Now, here's where the American model becomes distinct. China's system is centralized and state-directed. Ours is competitive. The rivalry between SpaceX and Blue Origin for the NASA human landing system is a perfect example. Two companies pursuing two different designs, pushing innovation forward because capital and credibility are on the line. Competition drives performance up and costs down. Private markets reward efficiency, and public-private partnerships distribute risk. Companies like Intuitive Machines and Firefly Aerospace aren't waiting for the next Apollo. They're building lunar landers now. And at the end of the day, we won't have one single national champion, but an ecosystem that's resilient. Now, earlier I talked about the faded American flags left on the moon during Apollo, where time and radiation had taken their toll. Today, the only visible American flags on the surface actually aren't from Apollo at all. The first in over 50 years was a small flag carried by the Odysseus lander that the company Intuitive Machines built when it returned the United States to the moon after more than 50 years in 2024. It wasn't planted by a government astronaut. It was delivered by a commercial company working in partnership with NASA. And that might just be the most important shift of all. Today's one small step in Space Race 2.0 is not a footprint at all. It's a reusable rocket landing. It's a private lander touching down. It's an industrial base expanding outward. And when you combine that industrial dynamism with NASA's institutional stability, the Space Force's protection of the domain, and a coalition of nations aligned under the Artemis Accords, you get something powerful. You get innovation plus alignment, speed plus scale, and in a race defined not by one single landing, but by a sustained presence, that combination gives us a real chance to lead. When Neil Armstrong first stepped onto the moon, he left a footprint. When the flag went up, it marked a victory. But neither the footprint nor the flag were the real legacy of Apollo. The real legacy was everything that followed: the launches, the satellites, the communication networks, the invisible infrastructure that reshaped life back here on Earth. That's what winning actually looked like, and that's the lesson of Space Race 2.0. This race won't be won by who plants the next flag. It will be won by who creates the systems that last. Who creates the infrastructure others rely on? Who creates the norms others adopt? Who stays? Because flags fade, footprints erode, but permanence is what will shape history for all mankind. Thank you.